A lot of high-profile, big first-person shooters came out in 2004. Half-Life 2, Halo 2, Metroid Prime 2, Doom 3, Counter-Strike Source. Notice something all of these games have in common? None of them are on the PlayStation 2. Despite being the biggest console of the early to mid-2000s, the PS2 wasn't really the place to go to get your fix if you wanted first-person shooters, and that makes some sense. Around this time, the FPS genre had become a space for technology-pushing graphical showcases. The PS2 wasn't the best place to make one of those. It was the most popular console of its time, but the least powerful platform that wasn't a handheld or something. First-person shooters were a really big deal though, so you can't fault Sony for trying to get an exclusive FPS for their platform. And they really tried hard to make the most commercially appealing mid-2000s FPS possible. What's popular in first-person shooters right now? Interplanetary science fiction and World War II? Let's just combine the two together. So in November 2004, amongst all these other first-person shooters, Sony published Killzone, developed by Guerrilla Games exclusively for the PlayStation 2. Set far in the future on a terraformed planet called Vector, a gang of plucky misfit soldiers in the Interplanetary Strategic Alliance, the ISA, have to prevent a brutal invasion from the Helghan Empire. The Helghast from the planet Helghan are a people who, according to the manual, lost something called the First Helghan War, and ever since have been living rough on their world where the terrible living conditions have caused them to mutate into big, hulking, pale, bald chaps. Scholar Visari unifies the downtrodden Helghast people into the Helghan Empire, an authoritarian, totalitarian, supremacist regime that now plans on invading Vector, partially out of revenge for the outcome of the First Helghan War. Thus begins the Second Helghan War we'll be experiencing in this game. So yeah, the allusions to World War II are not subtle. Probably could be assumed, but in the Killzone visual design book, Dutch studio Guerrilla Games confirms that they based the conflict of Killzone on the occupation of their own country in World War II. The Helghast are inspired by the totalitarian regimes of the early to mid-20th century, like Stalin's USSR, Mao's China, and of course Nazi Germany.
Now is our time!
On the opposing side, the ISA is a futuristic take on the contemporary liberal market economies of today's quote-unquote free world. Basing the antagonists of your game off regimes responsible for some of the biggest real-life atrocities of the last century is a surefire way to immediately communicate to players who likely live in societies with an opposing ideology more in line with the protagonists that the Helghast are bad news. What was really a stroke of genius, though, was the emphasis that was placed on these antagonists throughout advertising. Rather than depicting a larger-than-life character the player will be taking control of, the majority of Killzone's marketing and branding focused on the Helghast, the characters you'd be fighting in the game. This made the series stand out in its early days, as the box art read more as a challenge to the player, instead of an invitation to embody some extraordinary individual. It was asking the consumer if they were up for the challenge of taking on this imposing enemy. Really, I bought this design book to see if Guerrilla was inspired by Jinro when designing the Helghast, but apparently they just liked the gas mask look and then added red eyes when playtesters were having trouble shooting them. Which, fair enough, I can believe that. I recommend reading Killzone's manual because it provides more setup and world building than the game does, to be honest. Look at this, isn't this cool? It's made to look and read like an in-universe ISA magazine. It's got in-universe recruitment posters and adverts for fast food, all very liberal market economy style. There's little stories about the state of Vector during the invasion. Politician appeals for temporary ceasefire, and it's a section explaining how the pause screen works. This stuff's pretty charming to me. On second thoughts, maybe don't read this thing, it will make you miss game manuals. What will strike you the most about Killzone's gameplay is its stark indifference to the player. There's no music during gameplay in Killzone, no stings to punctuate the ebb and flow of battle. All you hear is the brutal sounds of gunfire and explosions, and the noise of people screaming at each other. Even at full energy, you can be taken out fairly quickly, and health only regenerates a small amount on its own. Combine this with slow movement and you have a shooter that really forces you to take your time and methodically make your way across enemy-infested land. Checkpoints are fairly scarce and scattered, making every step forward tense and laden with consequence. Despite being set in the future on some new planet humanity has settled on, the weaponry used here is fairly conventional and plausible. The look of Killzone is more similar to the near-future shooters like Modern Warfare that would crop up a few years after it, rather than its contemporaries in the sci-fi shooter genre like Halo. This gives Killzone a bit of an original touch for an FPS, set considerably in the future but with a very grounded style. Killzone encourages disciplined, cautious play with a strict checkpoint system that can be pretty punishing. This will indeed have you considering what to do carefully, but inevitably when a game's main punishment for failure is to have you repeat big chunks of it, there's gonna be the odd frustrating moment. That frustration is compounded in Killzone as a slow-paced game. The least I think a hard game where you can die fast that has scarce respawn points should do is to be able to get you back in the action as fast as possible. Killzone is at its worst when it owns you and fails to do that, having you replod through fairly uneventful areas to get back to the meat of things again. You'd think for a game that chugs so much in terms of performance that Killzone would be outputting some mad visuals for PS2. But really I can't say that it is. It looks fine, but I'd say the console has much better lookers in terms of art style and raw graphics, some of which run a lot better than Killzone. I will say that there are some pretty large levels though, environments can get pretty big, so yes, those parts are pretty impressive for the system. But again, that performance, it ain't good. I don't know if any graphical quality would make up for how much this game chokes. I wouldn't really call Killzone a polished game in general. Low inconsistent frame rate, weirdly compressed audio.
Here they come!
Classic moments where you touch the wrong thing and instantly die. Repetitive looking environments, the melee kills feel weak and almost unfinished. Shooting feels pretty bog standard. It's not super satisfying, but it's not totally limp and unsatisfying either. Killzone 1 has potential that isn't really fully realized. The interplanetary conflict with real-world influence has a lot more to offer than just a pretty good manual. The story does capitalize on the premise a little, but not as much as it could have. You get 4 characters to play as, each with a different background and set of skills, who spend the bulk of the game trying to regain control over Vector's defense systems. One of them, Hacker, is a half Helghast, half Vecton character who defected from the Helgan Empire.
Half Helghast, half human.
He's distrusted by Rico, your heavy weapons guy, and the two bicker throughout the game.
You bastards don't even give a shit about your own.
Hacker is a pretty interesting character, and his dynamic with Rico is fun.
Even a monkey will write Shakespeare given enough time.
What the fuck is a Shakespeare?
Seeing the two butt heads the whole game, only for their battles to bring them together.
Fuck this!
Rico saving Hacker at the end is one of the game's highlights. It's probably the emotional peak of the whole series, to be honest. The thing is though, you also have Jan and Luger, your other 2 playable characters, who are just kinda boring.
Are you asking me if I got laid?
What? No. Gee.
They have some sexual tension, great, but they're just a bit generic. Vanilla captain protagonist and smug assassin. They're characters who don't really inform us much about the universe of Killzone the way Rico and Hacker do. They could be characters in any shooter with an army in it. I feel like more of a focus should have been placed on Hacker and Rico. I think their dynamic alone is interesting enough for a full game's worth of character development. Hacker, a great character to explore the Vecton Helghast conflict with.
Your mother pretends you're dead already. The rest of your family never even mention your name.
Someone split between both factions who makes the choice to betray a side, paired with Rico, a Vecton who hates and mistrusts all Helghast.
The Helghast scum wiped out my entire platoon, and they'll be paying off that debt in blood for as long as I breathe. Sir.
I see.
It's the best part of this story, but I think it could have been taken further if given more focus. Taken in its totality, it's hard to call Killzone anything but fairly mediocre. But you can definitely see some cool ideas with potential for expansion. You can see why it would be worth continuing the series.
Better be worth all this bullshit.